Should go ahead and start.
Mhm.
Welcome to the Accounting Design Project workshop series. My name is Badria Al-Husseini. I am an assistant professor at Arizona State. I will be moderating today. We are excited to have Matt Kubic from UT Austin to present his paper on how inflation affects value relevance. So just a few housekeeping items. Please make sure you're muted unless you're asking a question. And when you do ask a question, please make sure your video is on so we can see you. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function and I will call on participants in order. Lastly, please give Matt 5 uninterrupted minutes to introduce his paper. Thank you, Matt. You have an hour. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the conference organizers for having or for providing us with the opportunity to present this paper today. So it's both a paper that's somewhat very new and somewhat very old. So I was just talking with a young, this was something Oliver and I actually started back when we were PhD students at Duke in 2019, early 2020. So we had a very, very early draft. And at the time, inflation was not particularly at the top of mind. So we kind of put it on the back burner. COVID happened, and then we reconnected recently and decided to dust it off. So let me make sure this is working. So how does accounting deal with inflation? So in short, it doesn't. And to a large extent, this is memorialized in the FASB concept statements. So if you were to read concept statement 5, it says something like, as rates of change in general purchasing power increase, financial statements expressed in nominal units become progressively yet less useful. So that would be a statement directly from concept statement 5. And essentially what we're doing is trying to see how we could go about testing this assertion that exists in the FASB conceptual framework. And then if you were to read along in the same paragraph, it also notes that an increase in inflation to a level, an unspecified level, at which distortions become intolerable, might lead the board to select another more stable measurement scale. And so the motivation for this paper, or one of the reasons that Oliver and I picked it back up, is obviously there has recently been a change in inflation. So we thought it was a good time to pick this paper back up and re-examine it. So what are we doing? So our research question is pretty straightforward. So does inflation lead to changes in value relevance? So to test the assertion that is in the FASB conceptual framework about financial statements becoming progressively less useful, we need a way to operationalize that. And we're going to look to the value relevance literature. So the research design here is going to be building on a lot of the value relevance papers from the late 1990s, where we're going to look at value relevance over time. We're going to use nearly a century of data. So we think this hand-collected data is pretty important because it covers the pre-CompuStat period, where inflation behaved a lot differently. In the post-CompuStat period, especially from 1970 on, there is some time-trended inflation. So we think the pre-CompuStat period allows for some nice tests. And once again, we're looking at value relevance because the value relevance literature is one attempt, one well-known attempt to operationalize the FASB conceptual framework about what is potentially useful. And the motivation there is, so for over a century, accountants, academics, practitioners, standard setters, et cetera, have expressed concerns about inflation. So these concerns go back to at least the 1920s, and even then, some of the concerns you can see going back even further. And from a value relevance perspective, I think a lot of the papers in the 1990s looking at value relevance were trying to answer the question and understand the implications of the question of, has accounting lost its relevance because we see a decline in value relevance, or perhaps value relevance stagnating over time? And we are going to say, okay, well, inflation might play a role in that. Why might play a role in that? So we have kind of competing predictions. So the first is what we'll refer to as the historical cost accounting channel, or essentially what the FASB has put forward in the conceptual framework. So since accounting relies on nominal historical transaction amounts, there's going to be a divergence from economic reality on the balance sheet and income statement. So here, taking an example directly from FAS 33, so they give the example of buy inventory for 100, hold it for 1 year, inflation's 40%. It's going to look like income of 40, but that income is due solely to inflation. Whereas if you had a firm that bought for 100, made an immediate improvement and sold it for 140 and didn't have any effects of inflation, they would have the exact same income. And so that's one of the examples used in FAS 33, which was a historical standard on inflation. On the other hand, and so I think the historical cost accounting channel would predict that as inflation is higher, accounting becomes, at least the way we operationalize it, less relevant. The other channel would be the cost of capital channel. So here the idea, to the extent that there's some type of stickiness in prices, inflation is going to increase the cost of capital and thereby the relative importance of near-term payoffs. So if the cost of capital is zero, the cash flows in T+1 and T+10 would receive essentially the same weight in firm valuation. Cost of capital is substantially high. The T+1 cash flows become incrementally more important, while the T10 cash flows might, essentially become zero once discounted back if the cost of capital is high enough. And so we think under this channel will lead to a positive association between inflation and value relevance. So competing predictions and a brief preview of what we find. So here we find a pretty significant positive correlation between value relevance, indicating what we call the dominance of the cost of capital channel. So here's looking at both over our sample period and in order of importance, right? So if you just look at previous factors explored in the value relevance, whether it be the tenure of different standard setters, the types of firms, whether those firms have losses, a time trend, other macroeconomic components, what we find is inflation seems to be, in our data, the first order determinant of value relevance. So certainly
Matt, we have a question from Christine.
Absolutely.
Can you go back 2 slides for me, Matt?
Sure. This one?
Yeah. So this isn't really a question about your paper. It was just something that I think about sometimes when I think about that example that you give, where you've got $140, in revenue, but $40 is solely due to inflation. And then your second bullet point is talking about the cost of capital that the market applies in determining the value of the entity. So if the market incorporates the inflation adjustment in the denominator, so they're accounting for that in the denominator of the valuation equation, wouldn't it almost be double counting if the revenue only reported the 100? Like the $40 needs to get left in the numerator if you're going to account for the inflation effects in the denominator.
So
you can't do it in both places, right?
So I still think you would want to be able to disentangle between these two firms, right? So to the extent one firm's business model is, so both firms, under the example of one buys something immediately, turns around, does some improvement, turns around and sells it for 40. As price levels change, as inflation changes, if they're only holding inventory for say 5 or 10 days, whatever their process is, right, is generating some type of 40% margin. And that's going to be the same whether inflation is low or high. The other firm in this example, if inflation was to go to 0%, would then have essentially no margin. So I do think you would want to be able to disentangle those two different ones in the way that they're presented, or at least that is the idea underlying what was disclosed in, or the proposed required disclosures in FAS 33, which existed for a period of time before they were now defunct, just trying to disentangle between those two. Right. And I think FAS 33 also talked to some extent about the nature of the adjustment. So whether it's going to be an asset-specific adjustment or a general adjustment, once again, acknowledging that general adjustments are easier to calculate, but then really don't help you in any meaningful way disentangle between the firms. In this case, it would help to some extent because you would account for the holding period of the inventory. But whereas a cost-specific one would actually then allow for you to see adjustments between different types of firms. I think that was.
Thank you.
We have a question from Kent.
This cost of capital channel, could you elaborate a bit on this? Because, I mean, when you think about firms here and you think about increasing inflation, you would really expect that in the longer run, they would adapt to inflation. So if inflation is high, they would kind of increase their profits in the future in order to be viable in the future. So, but is it really the cost of capital channel? Is it really concerned with the cost of capital? Isn't it rather concerned with the fact that when inflation increases, you get more and more uncertain about what's going to happen in the longer run? So it increases the riskiness of the business model of the firm because you don't know whether it will be able to adopt to changing prices so that it will remain viable in the long run. I would rather view it as some kind of increased riskiness here, because inflation increases the riskiness of running a business model.
Okay, yeah, so I'll take that questions in a couple part. So for the first is, I guess, what is driving the increase in riskiness? So is it inflation or is it uncertainty? So we attempt to control for macroeconomic uncertainty in some of our regressions, although we acknowledge there are other types of uncertainty that could affect it. And you're right, if prices change immediately in response to any change in inflation, then there wouldn't be much of a concern. So we do need some type of price stickiness in order for this to be a meaningful channel. And I think the idea underlying this channel is essentially that whether it's managers or investors, when discount rates get higher, then earnings that are relatively near term become relatively more important in the valuation equation. So what we're not saying is that accounting somehow becomes better or worse. We're just saying to the extent that accounting helps you predict, say, T+1 cash flows relatively better than it helps you predict T+20 cash flows, and discount rates become higher, those T+1 cash flows become relatively more important in explaining firm value. And thus, I think that's the idea that we're trying to have here with the cost of capital channel.
Noor?
Yes, so I also have a question on the impact of inflation on the cost of capital. And I was wondering, wouldn't we normally think about the inflation and the sort of the expected inflation, so the inflation in the medium to long term, which would have an impact on the cost of capital or the required return that we would have. So how would sort of, for example, hyperinflationary periods have an impact on expected returns? If you can elaborate with that.
So how would hyperinflationary periods? So I guess I'll go through that in two parts. So I guess one is hyperinflationary periods, and then the other one would be expectations regarding inflation. So we have tried looking at different ways to incorporate expectations regarding inflation, say perhaps in the next year, and everything seems to flow through about the same. So proxying for next year's inflation as an expectation, and we still see similar results regarding hyperinflationary. So there are some previous papers that we do discuss looking at areas like I believe it's Zimbabwe that have experienced some hyperinflation, and internationally they do have some standards that deal with that. Although we would consider that a slightly different stream of research than what we're looking at here. So we're not doing any type of cross-country comparisons. Although they do have different standards, and research has sought to evaluate to what extent those standards help or do not help. Here in the US, we don't have any standards that are directly related to hyperinflationary accounting. So FAS 52 on foreign currency would say to the extent that you operate in a country that has a hyperinflationary economy, you should just use the US dollar, I think, as the functional currency for that enterprise or that piece of your business. But that really wouldn't tell you what to do in the United States, since the US dollar is already the functional dollar for all firms. So I don't think there's anything directly related in the US.
Barrett?
Hey Matt, how you doing? I have a comment. It's kind of related to what Christine and what Kent were asking about, I think, but maybe it'll also help to fine tune Christine's question a little bit, which is, how does the effect you're talking about in this paper, you're saying this is an inflation effect. How is this different from just a general interest rate effect? Like, in Christine was saying, okay, well, if you've got inflation, the denominator is going up because you got a bigger discount rate, but the numerator is going up too, right? Mm-hmm. If it's just a straight up interest rate effect, we have had periods of time over, say, the last 20 years where interest rates have moved around some, but inflation hasn't been large. So you could maybe isolate like an actual denominator effect versus, this mixing of the numerator and denominator.
Okay, yeah. So I see what your point is. I try to isolate which of the two it is, and then to what extent is it, are you having a perfect change in cash flows that immediately, right? So 10% change in cash flows, and your discount rate changes, and there's essentially no effect on firm valuation. So disentangling that story from just a higher discount rate effect. Is that what you're suggesting, Barrett?
Yeah, I mean, basically, because because I know, you know, inflation's been a hot topic, so I can see why you'd want to motivate it that way, but I'm just wondering, is this really inflation per se, or is this just the discount rate, you know, that's being applied? And so kind of absent inflation, do you still, you know, find that that would affect value relevance, changes in value relevance over time? Because I searched your paper and I didn't see the word interest rates in there anywhere. So just curious.
Yes, I think our cost of capital channel, so anything that would increase the cost of capital, we think would put more weight on current earnings relative to long-term earnings. And so would lead to that same prediction. So as long as you're placing, you know, relatively more weight on current earnings, that would be consistent with that cost of capital channel.
Yeah, so I think maybe just a suggestion then would be to maybe think about that so that you can say, is it, you know, what effect does inflation have, if that's the motivation, you know, incremental to just discount?
Okay. Yep.
I got one more question from Ayong.
Hi, Matt. I appreciate that you jumped straight into these two hypotheses. I think that's the most interesting part of the paper. I have two questions. The first one related to your H1. So like the hypothesis here, you seem to talk about the divergence between accounting and economic reality, but I think later on your value relevance measure, following the literature, you seem to use a stock return or stock market. And I think there potentially a disconnection between stock price movement versus what's the true economic reality during especially high inflationary period, right? Because stock prices also is quoted based on the nominal values. So I think that's my first question, is that how do you, I feel like this motivation for disconnecting with true economic transactional activities seem to kind of disconnect with your value relevance measure.
Okay, so I guess to summarize your question, so for H1, why do we choose to look at value relevance, which is you know, an approach that's essentially going to have returns you know, as the dependent variable? And so to some extent, we do want to build on prior literature. So as mentioned on the previous slide, we are attempting to operationalize what the FASB has in the conceptual framework there in concept statement 5, which is discussing once again about financial statements becoming progressively less useful when inflation is high. And I guess our intuition of the way that we thought about it was value relevance is one way, not a perfect way. So we acknowledge that there are other ways, but certainly one way that has been used in the past to try to operationalize this idea of usefulness of financial statements. So we want to stick to some extent to the design choices that are in prior literature, because that also then allows us to speak to, you know, in those settings, when you see a decline or a, you know, level amount of, you know, decline of value relevance or value relevance, maybe declining a little, maybe staying roughly stable, but inflation is falling substantially during those periods. We think our current design sticking to that allows us to speak better to that. I would acknowledge that our test, you know, they're using returns as the variable. Prior finance literature certainly looked at how returns are affected during periods of inflation. But we, you know, we control for different macroeconomic conditions. I don't know that there's anything there that I guess.
I think one potential kind of different ways to proxy for economic activity to think about, like the dollar amount in the financial statement is usually the product of price and quantity. So if you, for certain industries like retail, some of the industries actually has data on the quantity input and output, that potentially will be another way to actually test your hypothesis regarding H1, because right now you don't find consistent result with H1. I was just wondering whether because the proxy you are using is actually not capturing what you're saying in the hypothesis. So that's potentially for certain industries that when the data is easy to get for the long horizon, from the 20s till now. I know auto industries also have that data too. Potentially you can directly test that. I'm happy to share some of the industry data I've used in the past, just to decompose the dollar amount into price and quantities, and then to see, because your story here is that quantity somehow doesn't increase that much, right? Your inventory story is that Q stays the same, but P somehow inflated because of inflation hypes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was not familiar with that automobile data, so I do think that would be a potentially useful path. I think one of the things that we want to do, once again, getting back to the FASB conceptual framework, is we do like the longer time series. We do think that is pretty important, especially in the pre-CompuStat period, or I'd say the post-1970 period. Because I think one problem or one issue that we've discussed with certain potential tests is that if it's just 1970 to say, well, essentially 2020, so before the most recent spike in inflation, there's a pretty strong time trend in inflation. And so that's going to make disentangling the time trend or anything else that's correlated with the time trend, such as the rise of technology firms, the increase in loss firms, whatever it might be from inflation, pretty difficult. But when we go to, say, the 1930 to 1950 period, and if the automobile data is available there, then there's no real time trend. And so thus, we think using both periods is presumably helpful. And so I think that's something that it sounds like we would be able to do with this data. So thank you for that.
My second question is, I assume that you got a lot of questions about the second hypothesis about cost of capital. So I wonder that whether you would consider, you and your co-author would consider some valuation model or some Campbell 1991 type of a decomposition to actually lay out a structure to tell us where are the different pieces of earnings and also stock returns were related to inflation. Because since that we have talked about the expectation component, we have talked about the cash flow news, discount rate news, and then in the income statement, their revenue, their expenses, they all have a different extent of the relationships with inflation, right? So there are probably like a lot of things going around, and then you pick one as hypothesis two. So I think that's kind of like a lot of questions are actually coming from when you pick this one. How about other things? Have you thought about that? So I think a model or kind of a framework would really help you to frame your second hypothesis.
So develop the second hypothesis a little bit more there.
Yeah, I think you
okay.
can either use a traditional kind of like Olsen type of model, or you can use asset pricing model to actually decompose the return into three components, or the combination of the two, and then talk about how inflation affects each component of the prices or each component of the firm value.
Yeah, so we could certainly build that out a little bit more there. And then once again, the intuition of the idea behind our cost of capital channel is simply that agents, whether it be firm management or investors, when they have higher discount rates, it's the current period earnings that they're going to place relatively more weight on. Or even if you think managers are making some type of an adjustment, prices have some degree of stickiness to them that could cause them to shift away from longer term projects to shorter term projects, with accounting being relatively then more useful and understanding current nearer term payoffs. I think is the idea that we have in mind there with that cost of capital channel. So it could be managers reacting to it, or it could just be investors placing more weight on near term earnings.
Thank you.
We got another question from Kent.
Yeah, that is with regard to this second hypothesis. I think also that, I mean, when you think about the information and the reliability and validity of information, that if you introduce more inflation, for example, into the setting, the information about the future and the predictions about the future will become more uncertain, more unreliable. And then you tend to lean on the information that you find more reliable, and then probably the near-term information that you have about the last period is going to get a higher weight in your assessment of what the valuation creativity, the valuation ability of the valuability of the firm is. So it's also the effect here that some information about the future becomes less reliable, perhaps less valid, and some information, near-term information, becomes more important then. So it would lead to the same type of hypothesis, but it would not really be linked to cost of capital in this way.
Okay, thank you for that. So that is certainly one of the ideas that we have in our mind, but clearly we are not appropriately articulating it in the paper. So that is helpful feedback, is to make sure that we are very clear in the way that we articulate that in the paper, because that is one of the ideas that we have. So I think what you said is what I would consider part of H2, although obviously it is not well articulated as currently stated in the paper, and so that is something that we will work on clarifying, because that is something that we have in mind. So yeah, we can do that. And we also like I like using the terms relevance and reliability. We had those in there at first. Unfortunately, since the FASB decided to change the conceptual framework, it loses its appeal when I have to say decision or no, representationally faithful. So relevant and representationally faithful just doesn't have that same ring to it when you write. And so, but that's something I suppose we'll get through. All right, and so if there's no other current questions, I'll go ahead and move forward. So that was a preview of the results, and then once again that. And so just, I guess, brief background, so having introduced the hypothesis. So all, three different standard setters that have existed have had projects on related to the accounting during high inflationary periods. All of the ones by the CAP and the APB essentially ended up with recommendations. While the FASB did have some requirements for new disclosures regarding inventory and PP&E, they were for a relatively small subset of firms, and then a lot of those ended up being pulled back or rescinded. And so over time, although this problem has, although concerns about nominal measurement and inflation have existed for a long period of time, we would observe that standard setters, at least in the US, for as long as there's been standard setting, have yet to have a project that changes the amounts recognized in the balance sheet and the income statement over time. Looking at what these proposed disclosures require, so once again, I think there's two ways you could think about potential adjustment, or multiple different ways you could think about a potential adjustment. So is it going to be asset or liability specific, or is it going to be a general adjustment? And then which assets or liabilities do you want to adjust? So do you just want to adjust monetary items? Do you also want to adjust non-monetary items? Recognizing that both could clearly have some type of effect from inflation. And so that's what the old FASB disclosures required, was a column showing general adjustments, with the adjustments not being to revenue, but being to cost of goods sold, and then depreciation or amortization expense, and then also adjustments to for specific and changes prices or asset specific changes. Once again, critics of this proposed approach, going back through some of the historical guidance, would point out that any fixed asset, or not any fixed asset, many fixed assets are financed with some type of debt. So presumably, if you're going to remeasure the fixed asset, the fixed asset is going to become more valuable. You're going to have more depreciation expense. Well, that debt you chose to borrow at a fixed rate, as inflation increases, you would also, in theory, have a gain. So increasing depreciation and amortization expense without perhaps representing or reflecting the gain on any type of debt remeasurement would then actually be potentially misleading. And so I think there's arguments about whether these approaches are helpful or not. And so these are two different approaches. And some prior research, I guess, so some prior research has looked at these and has generally shown that these disclosures, for the limited period of time that they were available, don't seem to be incrementally useful over essentially what was reported in the primary.
We have a question from Barrett.
And by the way, Barrett, when I look this way, I'm not looking away from you, I'm looking at you. It's the dual monitor.
Oh yeah, no worries.
I struggle with it.
Yeah, this is not a big comment, but on this idea of depreciation, and whether you'd adjust that, it seems weird that you would adjust that if you haven't also, would you also be revaluing that asset upward on the balance sheet? Because you said in the paper, you say that inflation causes a difference between accounting depreciation and like true economic devaluation when it comes to depreciation, but true economic devaluation is essentially a percentage of cost. So like the new number, inflated number isn't really the real number, it's some percentage. But so does the standard also require revaluation of the assets upward?
Just of inventory and fixed assets.
So it would do the PV. So like essentially you might still get to a place where it's the same percentage depreciation.
Yeah, so it would be the same. So it actually would mechanically, I believe, be the same.
Right. So it seems like that's not that much more informative. But anyhow, that was just not a big comment, but a small thing I was thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. So that would be the way the approach would work. Well, then once again, if you finance the purchase of that asset with debt, under the proposed approach and under these disclosures, you'll notice there is no adjustment to interest expense. And so somewhat you can even think about buying a house right now, right? So to the extent that you bought a house and the housing prices, change, but you have a fixed rate mortgage, right? You also have some change in value that's related to that fixed rate mortgage that would not be captured, right? And so there's going to be some disconnect there, even under these proposed adjustments. And so other people have said, well, maybe you should adjust all of the different line items. rather than just, cost of goods sold and depreciation and amortization. And I think an argument can be made. So once again, kind of outside the scope, I guess, of what we're doing in our paper, the adjustments would be relatively more easy for liabilities and for fixed rate financial instruments than it would be for, inventory or a building. So I think with most fixed rate debt, you could figure out, in Excel what the gain or loss would be due to a change in discount rates. Whereas, it's going to be a lot more difficult to come up with an asset specific for something like inventory. So even now, right, is it lumber? Is it eggs? Is it milk? Is it, what is it? There's a lot of variation there.
Kent?
Yeah, I mean, it might not be so important for your paper here really, but going back to these ideas of inflation accounting and current cost accounting, if you look at sources like Edwards and Bell and those guys, I mean, the idea was that you should also include the real value changes of the material assets. You should also include the purchasing power gain on monetary liabilities and subtract the loss on monetary assets. So I mean, these bottom line numbers here, they are just looking at the kind of harsh side of inflation accounting, increasing the cost side. But if you look at Edwards and Bell, the idea would also be that you would include the real value changes on material assets and the purchasing power gains on monetary assets liabilities. So, but it's not perhaps so relevant for your paper because, I mean, you're not going to do any adjustments and test that. So it's a side comment.
Yeah, no, I think that is a fair point, actually. So today I was proctoring exams this morning, administering exams this morning. And as I was administering exams, I saw the SSRN update with Ray Ball's paper on inflation that had just come out. So I was scrolling through it on my phone while I was administering the exams. And I think it makes some points similar to that, which is if firms have a substantial amount of debt, so most firms are in debt, what you would essentially then happen is if you were to remeasure all that debt, you're going to have very large gains in the income statement as inflation increases. And so while in this example, it's going from 9,000 to a loss of 9,000, if this firm, and for firms that have even the most debt, would then have the largest gains. So the gains from remeasuring your debt would be the largest for those firms. And so a firm that, if the same firm had hundreds of millions in debt, right, they would have then a large gain as they sought to remeasure that debt under that general purchasing power.
Joshua?
Just a simple question from somebody who lived in a country that had 300% inflation 1 year. What we witnessed there was that the sort of SEC required companies to disclose the fair market value of their fixed assets. So no change in the accounting, and only disclosure so people could come up with the value of the assets. And the question is, don't we try to achieve too much by asking the accounting to be changed instead of just disclosure?
So we're asking too much, I guess, of the accounting. So that I think that's a valid question. I guess one I'm hesitant to speak to. But I guess that's part of the the motivation behind this paper is this idea that for certain levels of inflation, so putting hyperinflation aside, for certain levels of inflation, the FASB has at least posited in their conceptual framework that if it gets high enough, it might be worth revisiting whether or not we want to have some type of different measurement attribute that is applied, in contrast to nominal measurement attribute of historical cost. And so we were trying to provide some evidence one way or the other to shed light on that assertion. And we're in this paper going to be hesitant to make any type of policy recommendations. But with that statement, we would note that our measure of value relevance, which once again, is looking at the relation, the variation of returns explained by earnings and changes in earnings, does not seem to go to zero when inflation is very high. So, you know, does that say that nothing should be done or something should be done? We're not gonna, you know, we're not gonna go into that. You know, we're not gonna reach any conclusions there. But we're gonna say, at least value relevance as previously measured in the literature, it is not going to go to zero. And then we're also going to, you know, hint at this idea of if you see a large decline in value relevance over a period of time, you do not, or it might be, you might not want to immediately conclude that that is because accounting is somehow getting worse over that period of time. It could be due to other changes, and we're going to point to inflation as one of those primary changes. So maybe a word of caution there.
Yeah, hi, Matt, when I read your paper, I also have a similar question. That's I think when you talk about the high inflation period in the 70s, and then there's a standard back in the 1979 you cited, it made me kind of wonder that whether we always have this conversation about whether we need to reconsider the inflation accounting whenever we experience a high inflation, and then usually how long do we actually going to propose a new standard, and then potentially that time period would actually much longer than the high inflationary period, and then we can like move back to the normal life, and then 10, 20 or 50 years later we have the same conversation again. So is there anything we can learn from the history, like even beyond the empirical analysis, that anything we can learn from the previous few periods when when this economy has a high inflation, and how does the standard setting meeting notes and discussions has kind of like led them to any conclusion or changes back then?
Yeah, so I would certainly agree with your observation. And I think former SEC chairs have made this observation, perhaps almost in a joking manner, which is inflation always becomes a hot topic as it arises, but nothing is ever done because essentially the standard setting process tends to take longer than inflation typically persists. And thus, by the time any type of new standard is proposed, inflation in some cases has resided. And so I think that is certainly something that people have pointed out. Acknowledging that that's not necessarily a great reason not to consider any type of proposed adjustments, because to the extent that it does become an issue again, that might be something that people are worried about. And you could certainly imagine an alternative accounting. Although I would note that while some, and this is, I guess, outside the scope of this paper, in some cases the standard setting process does take a while. When I think about like the most recent financial crisis, I think FSP 115.1 and 115.2 were both done, in a matter of weeks. So depending on the urgency of the issue at hand, I think we have seen standards set, maybe under some pressure from the banking industry in very short periods of time. And so maybe that relative pressure simply doesn't seem to come about in the case of inflation. And I see Christine has
I was just going to say that I think, was there someone else that wanted to make a comment?
Oh, no, it's you, Christine.
Okay. I think to the extent that we're not hearing a hue and cry from investors, inflation is at 9%, FASB deal with this problem and help us, is indicative, is sort of consistent with, I would say, with your results, Matt, which is that the model seems to work okay within certain bounds of a level of inflation or a level of volatility of inflation. So your paper doesn't address this, and maybe this is a second paper for you guys or for somebody else, but another way of thinking, I like the way you came at it, to be honest, because I think it does tie into the conceptual framework and the underlying sort of assumption that is in there, that information is less relevant as inflation increases. Just spinning out a little bit though, another way you could phrase the question is, if we have an underlying assumption that we can use the monetary unit as long as it is relatively stable, and that stability in the monetary unit means we don't need to worry about any of this stuff. But when the monetary unit is unstable, then we have to worry about this stuff. And that instability could manifest either in a very high level of inflation, like 300%, or hyperinflation, however we define that, or in extreme volatility in the inflation rate. And so maybe someday somebody can take your analysis a step further and say, okay, well, can we look at that question of what are the bounds of where the monetary unit is stable enough that the result you're documenting seems to hold? But do we, if we get beyond those boundaries, then, you know, is there an issue that a standard setter would need to consider? So just a comment, it wasn't a question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good recommendation. And yes, Christine, I was aware. So I went through, both the invitation to comment and some of the roundtable meetings, hoping that I could find an investor group that had said something like inflation is destroying everything, and we could use that as motivation in the paper. And I couldn't find such a quote. So we don't have one in the paper, not due to lack of searching, but due to lack of existence. So yeah, we weren't able to find one. But if someone does tell you that, let us know, because we can put it into the motivation here.
I've had a lot of academics tell me they should care. I just haven't had any actual investors tell me they do care.
And so with that, I'll put on this slide for a minute. So I guess I'll go forward. So data and design. So as mentioned, we're going to have some data from the Moody manuals in the pre-CompuStat period, which is going to provide some inflationary periods that you wouldn't have post-CompuStat. You're also going to have less of a time trend in inflation, and you have a deflationary period as well. And so that's going to be our data and our approach. Once again, looking at returns, regressed on earnings, and the change in earnings. And so we use 3 different measures of inflation. We find very similar results for all 3. And here you just see how they look over time. And once again, we think the pre-CompuStat period is important because, as you can tell, there's more volatility there. There doesn't seem to be any type of time trend. Whereas if you look, say, from like 1974-ish through, essentially the most recent period, you do see a downward trend in the inflation measures. And so if we just had 1970 on, it'd be a bit more difficult to disentangle a time trend or other changes in the economy. But we think that showing results hold in both different periods to some extent helps address these alternative interpretations or explanations that we might have. So once again, here's the association between inflation and value relevance on a smooth basis. And here would be what a scatter plot with a regression line through it would be. So this is, I believe, all 100 of our data points here, or not 100, 90, 96, 98 yearly observations, what the line looks like. And in regression format, so here's what we find. If the dependent variable is earnings relevance, so once again, the R-squared from that regression, whether we use PPI, CPI, or GDP deflator, we find very strong positive association. So earnings relevance tends to be much higher in periods when there's high inflation, without much for GDP growth or unemployment. And then once again, controlling for macroeconomic uncertainty. And so we would say this evidence suggests that H2, the cost of capital channel, is greater than H1, the historical cost accounting channel. Or said differently, this suggests that in periods of high inflation, the percent of variation in returns that is explained by accounting numbers, by earnings, and change in earnings is higher.
Kent, we have a question from Kent.
Yeah, just a short question here. Do you see a difference here in your results when it comes to periods where you have strong changes in inflation? So if you go from a low inflation rate period to a higher inflation rate period, do you see different results in that type of setting as compared to when you have a steady period with, say, 10 to 15% inflation from year to year? So that's my question.
Yeah, so and I think that was similar to what Christine had brought up before, is also looking at the volatility or other types, which is something that we don't have in this current iteration of the paper. We could certainly do. So look at, say, be with PPI and say standard deviation of PPI over past 5 years or whatever the amount is. Acknowledging that we don't have a ton of data points, so we probably have to limit it a couple of years. But that is also something that we could add in.
Doron?
Yeah, the last time that we had inflation was 40 years ago. Fixed assets were much more important then than they are today. So you would think that in the current environment, the inflation distortions are much less significant, at least the longer term effects, because fixed assets are much less important. So this probably means that your results are even stronger in the sense that, again, the negative effect of inflation are probably smaller now than they used to be. So maybe this is something that you want to, maybe this is also why people are not as much worried about accounting now.
Yep.
The way they used to be in the past.
Yes, we're hoping, well, we'll see how things work out, but here in a few months, when we get another, or whenever it is, I actually don't know exactly when CompuStat updates, but I think, out of the last 40 years, the period with the highest value relevance was the most recent year. And so we're hoping once we get a new year of data in CompuStat that we also see the same thing, which, as you point out, would be, if you were to look at the different levels, I think you could do over time, perhaps because it's even less of a concern because there is not the same level of fixed assets right now, would certainly be something that we could do.
Shooting.
Hi, Matt. So the paper is very interesting, and I have two questions. So first one is about the sample. So I noticed that you use the annual observations, and I was wondering whether there are quarterly data also available. And so my second question, so for quarterly data, I think like you can sort of like expand the sample size like 4 times larger. And so another one is about the model. So I noticed that so currently you sort of regress the value relevance of current period on the inflation of the current period. I was wondering whether are there any association between the value relevance of current period and the inflation of the prior period. So like also, for instance, in this table, like what if you also include the PPI or CPI of the prior period as well? Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go through those in the two pieces. So why do we use annual versus looking at quarterly? So one of the reasons we used annual was just trying to build off Francis and Schipper, Lev and Zerwin, who I think in all those papers had used annual regressions. And then, as you point out, during the earlier part of our sample period, we're not going to have quarterly data. So it seems to be, a pretty common design choice to look at annual periods, which also gets rid of any type of potential seasonality concerns as well, although there's ways to adjust for that. So it's more consistent with prior research. And then it allows us to look at the pre-CompuStat period rather than being constrained to just the post-CompuStat period. I also know there was a change in reporting frequency for certain firms, albeit not all firms, in the 60s. And so there's a number of papers, I think by Arthur Kraft and co-authors, who look at that. So I don't know during those periods that we'd even be able to get quarterly observations. So once again, that would push us towards, a 1970 post period. And we think those earlier periods are potentially helpful. And I guess, yeah, so I think what I'm hearing here is in addition to PPI, we could look at, perhaps also changes in PPI, standard deviation in PPI, something like that. So we've done a tad of that, and we could certainly bring in more to the paper. Steve?
Yeah.
Last question.
Yes. I'm on. Am I? Yep. I'm trying to get my head around this. These are cross-sectional regressions, sort of at the average, right? But typically, I think investors, when they look at firms, they're asking them to what extent they give you a hedge against inflation. The way you can see it is some firms are like a variable rate bond and some firms are like a fixed rate bond, okay? And a variable rate bond, of course, everything adjusts. So from that point of view, the question is to the extent to which, if I look at a firm, can it pass on the inflation very quickly in terms of revenues? How does it affect the costs? Can it actually reduce it, not raise costs? This is what people are talking about at the moment. And this is what investors, I think, are after. Now, the question, if that's the case, and if that's why their interest in inflation accounting comes from there, what is the effect of inflation accounting in terms of giving that information? Maybe I actually lose information. If it's a commodity firm which actually can raise its prices very quickly, I've got the hedge against inflation. Is inflation adjustment going to really mess me up on that? You don't get to this, but I think this is a really important underlying question in the whole issue.
Yeah, so So going to, different sensitivities of different firms. So if I was just to maybe go forward a couple of slides. So that was one of the ideas behind looking at this difference, low versus high equity duration. So trying to identify firms, once again, building off the Chow et al. Equity duration sensitivity paper. So we essentially do the same thing. And we find that for the high equity duration firms, where we're splitting on the median here, the results are approximately 3 times as large. So, or the coefficient magnitude, I guess I should say. So this is at a firm level regression is much larger. We had also done something similar, tried to identify, saying during periods of low versus high inflation, is it easier to identify firms that have relatively more or less market power by the ability to pass on prices to consumers? Once again, trying to split market power a number of different ways. So we had done something like, various measures of like Herfindahl index and how high you up you are compared to other firms. And we did not find much there, trying to split by market power, but acknowledging that market power is something that is, perhaps a tad difficult to say. And I guess those regressions would rely on us being able to identify the firms with market power, not using inflation to then identify the firms with market power. So it's a bit of a different design or different test.
Yeah, I think that's good to look at the differences in firms and their sensitivity to inflation. But an underlying question that I haven't worked out is how much inflation adjustment accounting would actually help you in that assessment of am I got a buying a stock with a good hedge or am I not? Okay. So I think that's an underlying. I haven't worked this out in my own mind, so I just raised the question.
Yeah, no. So I think that's a good question. How much would that help? And I think some of the papers who were looking at different aspects of what those required disclosures were back in the 1970s were trying to get at it once again with a very short period of time with just very limited information. Again, potentially with concerns about relevance and reliability, which in that period was certainly the framework that was outlined. So,
Kent?
Yeah, just a short question or a comment here and listen to your view on this. I mean, what you do here is basically that you're looking at stock returns and their association with earnings and earnings changes. But I mean, an accounting financial statement reports includes a lot of more information. But there are many other kind of indicators that you can calculate. So isn't the paper really about the value relevance of earnings and earnings changes? Because I mean, you haven't really investigated the full information content of financial statement reports.
Yeah, and so you're right. Our primary tests certainly focus on earnings changes in earnings. We also do some tests. I believe this would be the appropriate side. So looking at building off the Francis and Schipper paper, looking at asset and liability relevance, book value and earnings relevance. We document similar results for both of those. Although certainly acknowledging if you were to go back to that equation where you have returns, you could put a number of different financial statement line items on the right-hand side and get a different R squared. That then could become our dependent variable. And perhaps there are certain financial statement line items where maybe the association is different than the one we document, but at least of the primary ones that have been looked at in prior literature, we seem to find similar trends across all of them. And so that's what we've done here, but certainly acknowledging that in no ways is earnings, total assets, total liabilities, and book value of equity the entire encapsulation of what is contained in a set of financial statements. So we
yeah, I guess my point was I do believe that earnings will come through as having this type of increasing importance with higher inflation. But I mean, when we talk about the value relevance of accounting, we would like to look at the composite, the total information content, and then that would be complemented by a number of other indicators. So it would be the composite, the total information content that would be more of a complete measure of value relevance of the financial reports. That was just my idea.
Okay, yeah, and so yeah, I think that what you're recommending is similar to the Barth et al. Paper that came out in 2022, where they look at I think 16, 18 something. Forgive me if I'm miscorrect. I think I'll call it 18 different components of financial statements and take the R squared from that regression. So it has the ones that we have here, but then in addition, things like R&D, intensity, level of intangible assets, et cetera. And so that would be another way that we could come up with an R squared that you would use as our dependent variable. Is certainly something that we could look at.
Matt, you have a few minutes, so let's just give Matt a few minutes to conclude.
Okay, yeah, so I guess I'll go through. So yeah, inflation explains a lot of variation in either chart. We had done some tests on split low versus high assets, low versus high low versus high PPE, low versus high inventory. We found that results are consistent across low versus high PP&E. They attenuate some when you have high inventory, suggesting that perhaps some of the concerns might be more related to inventory rather than PP&E regarding potential distortions. The equity duration results that we discussed. We've done a little bit recently trying to look at both earnings and cash flow predictability, although that was not in the draft that we had sent out because it's something that we had just literally just done this week. Not too much to discuss there, but we essentially find little change in earnings predictability, perhaps some decrease in cash flow predictability, but it's hard to say, once again, trying to use 100 years and defining what exactly cash flow is in year T+1 when you have very different data sources over a long period of time. So we acknowledge there's some subjectivity there, but it is something that we were trying to do. And so I guess to wrap up or to conclude, so we think with inflation at a height, reignite some of the recent debate. We propose two potential different channels. And what we see is that inflation is positively correlated with value relevance. So higher inflation, higher value relevance. And so while we are hesitant to draw any type of policy implications, we would also note that to the extent that you see a decline in value relevance, it's probably important to control for what inflation is. And it doesn't necessarily mean that accounting is failing to do its job. It could just be the fact that very low inflation is causing investors to put more weight on future earnings, which accounting has a relatively more difficult time to predict. And that's all we have. And so I'll finish up with next time. So I'll plug for the next time. So I think Thursday, March 23rd, lease accounting, and it's a double header. So 10:30 to 11:15 and 11:15 to 12. So I'll leave that up. Thank you everyone for your time and feedback. I greatly appreciate the insight. And I hope everyone has a nice rest of their Thursday.
All right, thank you, Matt, for a great presentation. And thank you to all the attendees for your active participation. We look forward to seeing you at the next one.